Good evening, and welcome back to Dead Sleep True Crime for Bedtime. I'm your host and the creator of Dead Sleep, Nancy Miller. And if you are new to the podcast, I created this show for weird people like me, people who like to fall asleep to true crime and want a good story, a mystery told a little more mindfully. Stories written and researched by an actual journalist. That's me. And told in a way that's not too loud, not too violent, with no obnoxious advertising blasting you awake. I recently heard from people who like to listen to the show when they're not sleeping, when it's not bedtime. And I say, hey, it's your life. Go ahead. Listen to this show while you eat cake for breakfast. There are no rules, no right or wrong. But of course, that's not true. There is a right and there's a wrong. A set of rules we all live by. And that number one rule is killing someone is wrong. Morally, legally, it's not usually up for debate. But in the past week or so, with a deadly incident that happened in New York City, one you've heard all over the news, so I'm not going to get into it here. But what's relevant to this episode is a frenzy right now of people who have found themselves uncertain of what they used to believe as moral fact. In what world do people root for the killer and not feel appropriate grief for the dead? I'll tell you what world that is. It's the world in tonight's story. One that takes place many years and many miles away from a certain shooting in New York City. This incident took place in 1997 in a tiny town called Carthage, Texas. But it's no less a shocking saga about a murder in a small town where the suspect was so beloved and the victim so despised that it turned everyone's world upside down. What they used to think was wrong appeared to be right, and what they used to think was right was suddenly wrong. And in those circumstances, what was justice? All of a sudden, a whole bunch of people didn't know. And you'll hear all about it in tonight's episode. And as we settle in, here's one thing I do know. I love making this show. I never dreamed that there were so many people who were just like me, who like to listen to true crime before bed and wanted the flavor of story that I know how to tell. And I would love to continue making this show in 2025. I keep trying to find a way to do it faster and easier. But it still takes a fair amount of time, and it's an absolute labor of love. But if you would like to ensure this show's success, help support my work by becoming a subscriber on Spotify, Patreon, and Apple Podcasts. So if you've been thinking about subscribing, now is the time. Right now, you get a free month on Apple Podcasts and a free 7-day trial on Patreon. And as soon as Spotify offers something like that, I will totally offer that on Spotify. And if you are oversubscribed or you don't want to subscribe, but you still want to support the show, write a review, leave a comment, tell a friend. Word of mouth is how a little show like this breaks through. One of the best parts of making Dead Sleep is putting a spotlight on some of the best true crime writers ever. And tonight's story was drawn from the incredible work by reporter Skip Hollandsworth, one of the best true crime writers who's been at Texas Monthly magazine for 30 years. If you're into true crime, you probably know that Texas Monthly, they're one of the best places to find excellent long-form narrative true crime storytelling. And I've only been to Texas a handful of times, but I read Texas Monthly every month. I had a chance to interview Skip when I hosted a podcast for HBO Max in 2023. His interview is like a masterclass in what makes true crime storytelling really good. And here's a hint, it all comes down to the reporting. So to give credit where credit is due, I'm going to link to Skip's original piece so you can read the original version. This is the Dead Sleep version, my interpretation of the original case, with lots of detours and details to fatigue your mind, about a small town that had a big problem. One of their wealthiest, most prominent residents had vanished. It's hard to say when exactly Marjorie Nugent went missing, because technically, no one was looking for her. At least not at first. But it's fair to say the first time someone said something, that someone noticed she hadn't been around much in the small town of Carthage, that was around the holidays, just before Christmas in 1996. When someone said they heard maybe Marjorie was visiting a sister out of state, nobody really questioned it. The town of Carthage is in East Texas, not too far from the border of Louisiana and southwest of Arkansas. The closest city isn't even in Texas. The big city around there was Shreveport, Louisiana, about a 45-minute drive away. Many of the residents in Carthage were older retirees, so it wasn't unusual for these transplants, the folks from somewhere else, to head out of town this time of year for the holidays. If anyone had been looking for a sign, a clue, that something was indeed off in the life of Marjorie Nugent, the evidence was right there, in front of everyone, hiding in plain sight. Marjorie's stone mansion was one of the biggest, if not the biggest, house in all of Carthage, Texas. And that Christmas, in 1996, the house was adorned with a warm glow of holiday lights and decorations. Marge's place had a wonderful warmth to it. It was so festive. Perhaps too festive. Marge was many things, but festive, that wasn't one of them. Marge was the Grinch of Carthage, with a priggish, miserly nature 365 days out of the year. She wasn't one to indulge in holiday frippery, not big on spreading comfort and joy. Since Marge moved to Carthage, she was mostly known for spreading anxiety and fear, blanketing the entire town with her withering critiques. Carthage had a population of around 6,000 people, and Marge had managed to offend just about everyone she came in contact with. The people who lived there thought Marge was snooty. They said she looked down on them. And they were right. Marge did look down on that town. Because it was Marge's husband, her late husband, who was from Carthage, and when he retired in the 1980s, he decided he and Marge would move back to his hometown. But Marjorie wasn't a joiner. She didn't take part in community activities. She wasn't a giver either. Despite enjoying vast wealth, estimated to be around $10 million, Marge never donated a penny to local causes. She was even uncharitable with innocent animals. When her dog was sick, she balked at the $45 fee that the vet wanted to charge her, and she haggled with the vet until the vet finally just gave in for the sake of the sick dog more than anything else. Of course, that all happened before 81-year-old Marge made the acquaintance of a beloved local man, roughly 40 years her junior. His name was Bernard Tidy. Everyone knew him as Bernie. And Bernie, now he was festive. always sweet and upbeat, always quick with a smile or a song. You'd never guess in a million years what Bernie did for a living. Bernie was an undertaker, a mortician, at the local funeral home in Carthage. It's hard to believe that a man who dealt with death every day could be so buoyant and optimistic. His signature tune suited him perfectly. An old song called Beautiful Dreamer, which he loved to sing in the local choir. When he wasn't in his dark undertaker suit and driving in a hearse, he drove around town wearing bright pastels with Tommy Hilfiger logos emblazoned all over them. Bernie was proof that your circumstances didn't have to define you. And maybe that meant mean old Marjorie could also change, that she had changed, that maybe by the holidays of 1996, she was the kind of person who would decorate her house with good cheer. And if she were, that was all thanks to Bernie. Bernie had a pale but cherubic face with dark swept black hair and a dark mustache that made him look like a cross between a weatherman and an old actor from a black and white movie. Bernie grew up in a town about 45 minutes away from Carthage. In 1996, he was in his late 30s and had been living in Carthage for about a decade. He was what the locals like to call flamboyant, and he rarely hung out with women his own age. Not that there were that many in Carthage, Texas. The female population was mostly older widows, women in their 70s, 80s, and 90s, women who Bernie doted on, women who thought Bernie was the bee's knees. Bernie belonged to the local church, where he was the closest thing they had to a saint. He was one of the best singers in the choir, known for his rendition of Amazing Grace. And if the minister was under the weather, Bernie was the one who would give the sermon. Known for his deep knowledge of Broadway musicals, he was asked to conduct the drama department of a local college in their performance of Showboat and Guys and Dolls. In Carthage, he was a key member of the Christmas Decorating Committee. In 1996, he helped decorate Marge's mansion, which explains why it looks so festive. Just a little something he threw together for the holidays while Marge was visiting her sister in Ohio. For as upbeat as he was, Bernie came into his career as an undertaker quite tragically. He was just 3 years old when his mother died in a car crash. When Bernie was 15, his father passed away. To help support himself and his sister, Bernie took an after-school job at a funeral home, and Bernie learned the tools of the trade. He did the embalming, the hair and makeup, he consoled families, he even sang funeral hymns. And his voice was so beloved that the older people in town made their children promise that when one day they passed on, Bernie would sing at their funeral. Bernie's early losses and the loneliness he felt in that grief during childhood made Bernie a kind soul who saw it as his calling to serve others in their time of need, which meant helping a fair number of widows, and they were living, many for the first time, on their own. If they needed something, he was right there. And from that developed a deep friendship and trust. He didn't necessarily target just wealthy widows. He was friendly with all the ladies in town. But it just so happened, in 1990, when Marge Nugent's husband died, Bernie was at that funeral. And though they hadn't really met yet, Bernie could see pain on Marge's face, and he wanted to help. He felt sorry for Marge. He remembered watching her at the funeral and noticing how lonely she looked. So few people actually showed up to Marge's husband's funeral. Bernie felt compelled to befriend her. He remembered Marge's sour face as she stood by her late husband's casket. He also noticed that the poor woman had started shivering. Bernie ran to Miss Marjorie and gave her his coat. Then, after singing a hymn at the chapel, he helped her into a sleek town car, showing Marge a kindness she'd rarely ever known. Marge wasn't terrible to everyone. Those who knew her and liked her said you just had to earn her attention. And once you had it, you had to fight to keep it. Family members wondered if she suffered from depression. She experienced what they used to call blue periods, where she went into a dark mood and said hurtful things. It was hard to know what Marge was capable of when she was in one of those moods. She held grudges. Marge cut people off. She even had a sister in the same town, but the two never spoke over a disagreement they'd had decades ago when their mother died. She had a son who was all grown up and living in a different part of Texas, but he didn't come to visit much. They weren't that close. Members of her own family described Marge as a difficult woman to love. Sensing this, perhaps, Bernie paid special attention to Marjorie. He traveled to her estate and checked in on her nearly every day. Soon he was going to her house for lunch and surprising her with little notes of endearment he'd secretly leave around her house. And Bernie made sure Marge enjoyed what the town had to offer. He had a way of making a local theater production feel like the Great White Way. It seemed only Bernie was soft enough to smooth over Marge's prickly nature. And much to everyone's surprise, Marge exhibited a generosity towards Bernie no one knew she had. This included giving Bernie her late husband's watch, a Rolex, as a thank you gift. The watch was worth about $30,000 in today's money, which was a lot for someone like Bernie. But for Marge, a Rolex was a drop in the endless bucket of oil money. She didn't have to worry about money, which meant, finally, after being the dutiful wife of a Texas oil man who always called the shots, Marge had the time and financial freedom to do things her dead husband refused to do, like go on a fabulous cruise, which she did, with Bernie as her personal travel companion. And, rumor had it, the two had even shared the same room. In the beginning, people had fun gossiping about the relationship between Bernie and Marjorie, but it was just gossip. This was the early 1990s in a conservative Texas town, so nobody said the word gay. Instead, they used old-fashioned euphemisms to describe Bernie, to help convey that he wasn't your typical man's man. They said things like he was light in the loafers, and then left it at that. They didn't ask Bernie about his personal life, or even consider, really, that he had one. To the people in Carthage, Bernie was like a colorful character. He belonged to the town, and to the widows in particular. Bernie belonged to them. He was theirs. Which was why everyone, especially the town widows, were so concerned about what happened next between Bernie and Marge. In 1993, after a couple of years of steady friendship, Marjorie told Bernie she wanted more. She told Bernie she desired a deeper commitment from him. Over the past few years, Bernie had proven himself to be her most trustworthy and reliable, only real friend she had. The closest thing she had to what felt like family. And well, she enjoyed his company, personally and professionally. She asked Bernie if he'd be willing to leave his job at the funeral parlor and come work for her full-time. She was in overall good health, but as she approached her 80s, Marge knew she'd benefit from having someone around. She offered Bernie far more than he was ever going to make as a mortician. So was he interested? Bernie was intrigued, and he was excited. It was quite an opportunity, and it was hard to resist good money. But this offer, it didn't go over well with the other people in the town, the well-off widows who were already jealous of how much time Bernie was spending with Marge. And his friends, they worried about him. Bernie was always so nice. Maybe he was too nice for his own good. When word got around that Marjorie asked Bernie to quit his job and work for her, his boss at the funeral home warned him, "Don't do it." This was a devil's bargain. That whatever you think you're going to get out of her, his boss said, you're going to have to earn every penny of it. Already his friends noticed that Marge had Bernie on a tight leash, that she seemed possessive of him as it was. She was controlling and already making odd demands on his time, like making Bernie drive to her house every morning and fix her coffee. Was he sure that's what he really wanted? Not for her, but for himself, they asked him. Bernie shrugged it off. Deep inside, he said, "She's a sweet woman." His friends worried he was being naive. Later, much later, authorities would wonder if they had it all backwards. That Bernie wasn't the naive one. The entire town of Carthage was. That nobody saw Bernie for who he really was. A con man who had the entire town in the palm of his hand. In 1994, it was actually Marge who had Bernie under her thumb. He had taken Marge up on her offer, and what appeared to be playing out was exactly as his former boss had said, that Marjorie was very generous with Bernie. She'd loaned him the money for a 2-bedroom house. And through her, Bernie enjoyed the kind of finer things in life he'd always dreamed of, but could never have. Together, Bernie and Marjorie traveled all over the world. They sailed to Europe on the Queen Mary, then flew home on the Concorde, a supersonic commercial jet that could fly you from London to New York in just 3 hours. On the outside, Bernie was living the dream. Behind closed doors, however, it seemed like his life with Marjorie was a nightmare. Always demanding and impatient, Marge found new ways to keep Bernie close to her. She helped him buy his own 2-bedroom home, but he actually spent his waking hours at her place. First thing in the morning, Bernie had to have Marjorie's medications set out and ready for her to start her day. She also expected Bernie to eat lunch with her every day, and if he wasn't there at her house by 11:45 in the morning, she'd track him down. There weren't cell phones back then, so Bernie had a pager clipped to his belt. Pagers were largely used by people who were professionally on call, like ER doctors. And Marjorie seemed to think everything was an emergency. Whenever Bernie left Marge alone, she'd either page him nonstop until he came home, or he had to check on her several times a day. Even if he was in conversation with someone else, he'd abruptly stop chatting and find a nearby phone. He told a friend that if he didn't call her when she asked him to, she'd give him living hell. Over time, people did notice Bernie enjoying a positive influence on Marge. She started attending church on Sundays, arm in arm with Bernie. Through him, she'd become unexpectedly generous. The woman who wouldn't pay $45 for her own sick dog was now generously funding all kinds of things that people in town needed. She bought and donated 10 brand new cars to people who wanted them. She bought a home for a struggling young couple. She set up scholarships to the local college for students who couldn't afford tuition. She gave seed funding for small local businesses, including a fancy new men's clothing boutique called Boot, Scoot, and Western Wear. Her money had made a huge impact on Carthage, more than she could ever know. Because, well, the truth was, Marge didn't know anything about it. As Marjorie's personal attaché, Bernie was authorized to write and sign checks from Marjorie's account. When one of Marge's financial advisors asked her if she was certain she could trust Bernie, Marge grew so furious at the remark that she threatened to take her sizable business somewhere else. Not long after, Bernie started calling Marge's stockbroker directly, advising this broker on which stocks Bernie thought Marge needed to invest in. The stockbroker was stunned and furious. What could Bernie possibly know about the stock market, he said. He was just an undertaker. No sooner had this broker hung up the phone on Bernie that Marge called. In a tone so sharp it could cut glass, she warned her broker if he ever spoke like that to Bernie again, he was fired. Marge was obviously so fond of Bernie and so protective of him. The very people who were hired to mind Marge's money let any doubts they had about Bernie go. Who were they to say what Marge should or shouldn't do? It was obvious if they voiced their opinion, they'd pay for it, not Bernie. So when Bernie started writing checks and moving vast sums out of Marjorie's bank accounts, nobody said anything about it, especially not to Marge. And if anybody thought Bernie seemed a little free with the millionaire widow's money, they kept it to themselves. Bernie did appear to be living a life well beyond his means. At one point, Bernie earned his pilot's license and bought a Cessna airplane worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. But it wasn't like he was hiding anything. Back at the 2-bedroom house that he bought with Marge's money, he liked to display all 70 of his high-end luxury watches in the main room for everyone to see. To the town, Bernie was the same lovely guy he always was, and as far as they were concerned, he deserved all that good fortune. Most in Carthage would have admitted that there wasn't enough money in the world to get them to spend so much time with Marjorie Nugent. Not to mention, they were the beneficiaries of Marge's goodwill through Bernie. Bernie was like a Robin Hood, only he wasn't stealing from the rich to give to the poor. He had Marge's permission to sign all those checks. And it wasn't in anyone's best interest to probe into this matter more deeply, what Marge knew and what she didn't. The bottom line was her money was going to good use. To the town, and of course, to Bernie himself. Underneath his cheery demeanor, however, Bernie hid a troubling secret. At some point in 1995, Bernie confided in his sister that he was worried about Marge. She was always a control freak, but recently, her demands were borderline irrational. He was worried that she was beginning to show signs of dementia. She recently fired the gardeners who took care of the landscaping because, she said, the flowers they planted didn't bloom on time. Bernie also told his sister that Marge made Bernie buy a gun, a .22 caliber rifle, so he could shoot the armadillos that were destroying her yard. Bernie didn't know anything about guns or hunting or killing anything, especially not some poor animal. But Marge insisted that he do it. After nearly 5 years of friendship and the last few years in her employ, Bernie told his sister that it was all beginning to wear him down. His sister implored Bernie to just quit, just leave. But Bernie shook his head and said he couldn't. He was the only friend Marjorie had, Bernie said. And if he left, Marge would be all alone. Bernie felt responsible for her. She didn't have anyone else. Marge did have family, siblings, cousins, her son, but there was no one close enough to Marjorie to check in on her every day, or even visit once in a while. But it was Bernie who said that in December of 1996, that Christmas holiday, Marjorie was in Ohio visiting the one sister she was still on good terms with. He didn't specify when she'd be back, but until then, Bernie was in charge, which explains the decorating of Marjorie's mansion with all that warmth and holiday cheer. Christmas and New Year's came and went, and nobody concerned themselves all that much with Marge's whereabouts. However, in the early spring of that following year in 1997, as the snow thawed, interest in Marge heated up. One of Marge's cousins, who was also an elderly widow, stopped by to see how Marge was doing. And much to her surprise, it was Bernie who opened the door to the mansion. And he explained that poor Marge, she was home, but she was very ill and wasn't accepting visitors at this time. Later that spring, her financial advisor also checked in on Marge. He hadn't seen or heard from her directly in months. He was one of the very few people who didn't like or trust Bernie. So when Bernie told this advisor that Marge had actually moved into a nursing home outside of town, he was suspicious. Her financial advisor tried tracking Marge down, and when he asked Bernie which nursing home she was in, Bernie gave him some sketchy answer about how Marge said she wanted to be left alone and didn't want anyone to try and find her. Marge might have been MIA, but her money could be felt all over Carthage. Bernie was still offering money to anyone who needed it, even if those needs, in 1997, meant buying someone a new jet ski. Without Marge around, Bernie was able to reclaim some of the spotlight he'd lost living in Marge's shadow. In that April of 1997, Bernie was on stage again, just like the old days, performing in the Shreveport Choir, singing his signature song, Beautiful Dreamer, and received a standing ovation. Bernie performed quite a bit that spring and summer, so he didn't have his ear to the ground back in Carthage and didn't appear to be aware that in June of 1997, someone called the local Carthage police, asking them if they knew where Marjorie Nugent was. Bernie was also unaware, it seems, that Marjorie's son had also filed a missing persons report. And in July of 1997, her son had traveled to Carthage at the request of the police because they wanted to get inside Marge's house, look for any clues about where she was or what might have happened to her. By then, the local police suspected something was up. But what exactly that was, they couldn't fathom. So a local deputy, along with Marjorie's son and his eldest daughter, they all went to Marge's place. Her house was huge, so they took their time poking around, unsure of what they were looking for. Signs of what? Foul play? That was unlikely. The place was immaculately clean, just as Marge liked it. There was nothing suspicious here. After walking through the house, they decided to make one final stop, down into the basement. As Marjorie's son and granddaughter along with the police deputy, made their way down into the dark basement. The area was eerily silent. Almost. The only sound one could hear was the hum of a large chest freezer. That freezer was always there. That wasn't unusual. What did stand out, however, was how this freezer was shut. It wasn't just closed. The whole thing was sealed shut with a whole lot of duct tape. Marge's granddaughter was the one who noticed it, and she said to her dad, "Why would Grandma have sealed her meat freezer with all that tape?" The deputy told her and her father to stand back. Then he took a step forward, cut through all that tape, and opened the freezer door and peered inside. Through the fog of that deep freeze, he saw packages, just packages of frozen food. Then the deputy moved some of those little boxes aside until he hit a white sheet. He took a breath and peeled back the white sheet. Enshrouded in that sheet was 81-year-old Marjorie Nugent. Her body drained of life, her remains frozen solid. So in July of 1997, after who knows how many months of Marge's absence, they'd finally found Mrs. Nugent. What happened to her? How did she end up in the freezer? And who put her there? They had a lot of questions, and only one person of interest. Marge's only friend, who might also be her killer. Where was Bernie? That day in 1997, when authorities went searching for Bernie, he was easy to find. Bernie was with a Little League team and all of the kids' parents about to head to dinner, his treat. When the police said they wanted to speak with Bernie for some questioning, he looked confused. Once at the station, however, he was visibly nervous. And it didn't take long for Bernie to reveal what had happened. He confessed that on November 19th of 1996, that was 9 months earlier, he grabbed the shotgun, the one Marge made him use on the armadillos, and he used that shotgun to kill Marge. When they asked him why he did it, he essentially said he snapped. That she'd become so hateful and so possessive, he couldn't take it anymore. When word around Carthage spread that Bernie was in custody and he was going to be charged with the murder of Mrs. Marjorie Nugent, the town was in an uproar. The prosecutor hoped that people would see Bernie for who he really was, that he was a con man, that he was an actor, that he duped the entire town. Instead, the majority of the town rallied around Bernie, including a fleet of angry widows who pooled their money so they could cover Bernie's bond, which was $1.3 million. They managed to raise that money so quickly that the DA, who wanted Bernie to stay in jail, added additional felony charges to ensure that the bail was over $2 million, beyond the widow's reach. People were outraged over Marge's murder. Their outrage was directed at the police. Bernie didn't do this, and if he did, it was in self-defense. When the autopsy revealed that Marge was actually shot in the back, then people wondered if Bernie did do it, it had to be temporary insanity. She must have pushed him to the limit, which suggested it was justified. The district attorney, his name was Danny Buck. He couldn't believe what was happening. That here they had evidence that Bernie had killed Marge in cold blood, and nobody in the town wanted to believe it. Wherever he went, people made a point of telling him that Bernie was a good man, and that this DA, he needed to do the right thing, suggesting that he should find a way to let Bernie go free. Even when Danny Buck went to church, he couldn't escape this case. The Reverend would ask everyone, every Sunday, to pray for Bernie. Even revelations about Bernie's personal life didn't affect public opinion. During the investigation, when authorities searched Bernie's house, they found a stack of videotapes. And on those videotapes, Bernie was apparently having relations with various men in the area. There were rumors about the number of Carthage men seen with Bernie on these tapes. Apparently, there was a city official on one of the tapes, a state trooper, a sheriff's deputy. There were so many rumors about so many men being on these tapes. Somebody made t-shirts, which was, back then, the equivalent of going viral. One man showed up at a local high school football game wearing a t-shirt that read, "I'm the only one in Carthage not on the videotapes." And even with the nature of that scandal, in a small conservative town, people largely stood by Bernie. From the outside, it was incredible how people could look at the same piece of information two completely different ways. For instance, when it was revealed that Marge Nugent had changed her will before she died, making Bernie the sole beneficiary and cutting out even her son, to prosecutors, that was a sign that she was being exploited. But to those who were Team Bernie, this was evidence that he hadn't done anything wrong. She'd given him that money, and he was just spending it while she was still alive. As for the whole murder thing, those who were in favor of Bernie saw him almost as the victim, that he'd been isolated and mentally abused. This wasn't a premeditated murder. He'd reached a breaking point. A handful of Marge's family members, including her own son, said that the way that Marge was being depicted was completely inaccurate, that she was a lovely woman, and it was Bernie who, over the years of their friendship, had started to promote this idea that Marge was some kind of monster. The opinion of Marge was the minority. Most people saw her, even in death, as a mean old buzzard, and that Bernie was the victim who got caught in her sinister web, and he essentially shot his way out. And at one point, Bernie told his own sister that he felt trapped. Even though she was an elderly woman in her 80s, who knew how many years she actually had left, Bernie couldn't stand the thought of having to be with her one more day. Ultimately, the case went to trial, and somehow they found an impartial jury who found Bernie guilty of first-degree murder, among other charges, and he was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole, which, according to recent reports, could be in 2029. By then, Bernie will be 71, around the same age as all of those widows he helped all those years ago. After his conviction, that wasn't the end for Bernie. There was a whole other chapter in his saga, including having a movie made based off of the article in Texas Monthly, made by Austin-based director Richard Linklater. It was a dark comedy that starred Jack Black as Bernie and Shirley MacLaine as Marge. And that movie helps bring attention back to this case. And through a very bizarre series of legal finagling, Bernie was briefly let out of prison and lived with Richard Linklater for roughly 2 years before he had to go back to finish out his sentence. Bernie's supporters, if they felt any anger against Bernie at all, it was because of what he did with Marge's body. Why did he put her in the freezer when he could have disposed of her anywhere? He had a Cessna. What they didn't realize, he was an undertaker up until the bitter end. When he shot Marge, he took her remains and he embalmed them. And he put her in that freezer with plans to one day find the appropriate place, even though he despised her so much that he killed her. He said, in the end, no matter who you were or what happened to you or how you ended up, everybody deserved a proper burial, a place where you can rest in peace. Thank you for listening to Dead Sleep True Crime for Bedtime. As I said, there's a lot more to this story, as always, and I'll link to those key sources in the show notes. I'll be back next week with an all-new True Crime for Bedtime story. Until then, beautiful dreams and nighty-night.